Hello, everyone. My name is Vincent James, and I decided to do my course outcome story on alcoholism and more specifically, alcohol use disorder. I'm not going to go into much detail on the person that I actually interviewed for this assignment. Um, just just more on the fact that alcohol abuse is very diverse in what causes it, why people are more susceptible to it than others, and also the signs and symptoms that people show when they're using it, as well as the the multiple regions of the body that are actually affected when people are abusing alcohol. So I basically just wanted to start off with just a basic definition of alcoholism. I feel like sometimes the definition is a little confusing for some people because if you think of someone who just drinks excessively to the point where they're having 8 or 9 drinks in one night and then they just don't need to drink again for a while because it's not something that they need. That's usually considered binge drinking, which is different from alcoholism in the fact that people who suffer from alcoholism or alcohol use disorder um, don't really have the ability to stop, even for as much as a week, or for some people, even up to they can't even stop for more than a day. It's really a part of their normal routine, just as much as drinking water is or eating. Um, but some common factors that define alcoholism uh, are intense cravings, um, like the loss of self control, and the fact that even if they didn't want to drink, they don't really have the self control to stop themselves from drinking, even if they know it's bad. Um, Physical dependence is a huge one. Physical dependence is basically the body is so used to the person drinking alcohol that when they don't drink alcohol, it's almost that they're sicker or they're suffering from worse symptoms than they are when they're drinking it. And that's also very similar to withdrawal symptoms. um, People who suffer from shakiness, and we'll go into this later and more in depth in later slides. But withdrawal symptoms is a huge factor of alcoholism because if you think of someone who's trying alcohol for the first time, they may wake up the next day with a slight hangover, but nowhere near compared to a person who's chronically using alcohol and then tries to stop without any type of treatment. And then tolerance, which is basically the body building up resistance to alcohol to the point where you need to drink a lot more alcohol to feel the same effects. So this is the part that really interests me the most, just because it's kind of interesting that like alcoholism really, if in general, to most people in society, especially people who are not in the science or medical background, um, they look at alcohol and addiction as something that is the person's wronging or the person's choice, which in a lot of ways it is. Don't get me wrong, but there's a huge neurobiologic and pathophysiologic factors that go behind it as well, which is the reason that so many people are addicted to alcohol. Um, and I just put a few points on here. So the limbic system, which we've learned with over the years in anatomy and physiology, has a lot to do with emotions. And in this case, dopamine is a huge factor when it comes to alcohol abuse. Um, so the VTA, or the ventral tegmental area, is a region of the brain, and a lot of dopamine um, is released from this part. And there's a whole like motivation and behavioral motivation and reward area in this part of the brain. So when you drink alcohol, dopamine is released and into the brain, and it reinforces drinking behaviors. So dopamine is released into the prefrontal cortex, but it's not released directly. It's not like when you drink alcohol, alcohol doesn't go into the ventral tegmental area and stimulate the limbic system to directly release dopamine. It actually um, goes into other it actually affects other neurotransmitters like glutamate, GABA, corticotropin, releasing factor, and 5-HT, as well as other opiate and endogenous opiate systems like endorphins and calphins, um, which is a little bit beyond the scope of this class. But I just found it super interesting that basically the way that it works is almost like a positive reinforcement cycle. So when people drink alcohol, it it gives them this learning curve where when they drink alcohol, it affects their neurotransmitters in their brain, which goes to the prefrontal cortex, releasing the dopamine into the prefrontal cortex. Um, it causes an upregulation of certain certain receptors and a downregulation of others. Um, and the way that this is working and the way that this is affecting the neurobiology in the brain is called metaplasticity. It's basically the way that alcohol is affecting the human body in order to make you feel like when you drink alcohol, it makes you feel better, it makes you happy, and then that's how addiction basically is developed. So in the prior slide, I was a little broad when it came to the metaplasticity that alcohol causes, just because I knew I was going to include this slide, which is a little bit more detail on what what I was talking about when I was saying that the way that the upregulation and downregulation of these receptors and neurotransmitters does to the human body. So, so basically, the neurons are all about a balance between these excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters. It's all electrochemically um, it's all about electrochemical activation, basically. And acutely, when people drink alcohol, it's known as a depressant. The reason that it's a depressant is because it inhibits the flows of ions through a certain receptor called NMDA or N-methyl D-aspartate. These are glutamate receptors, and it also, at the same time as it inhibits flows of ions through the MDMA receptors, it also enhances the activity of GABA receptors, or GABA channels, I meant to say, which overall produces an inhibitory effect on neurons. Um, but the problem occurs when people are chronically exposed to alcohol because our bodies are very smart and are very adaptive, and homeostasis is something that we try to maintain, even as we learned throughout the different chapters, that basically sometimes when the body tries to maintain homeostasis, it's actually making things worse. And alcohol is sadly one of those things because um, when you're chronically exposed to alcohol, neuroadaptation takes place, which basically changes the signaling pathways with glutamate receptors. And when this happens, the upregulation of NMDA receptors and the changes in the glutamate receptors enhances the cues associated with drinking to the point where you don't even really need to drink alcohol yet for these neurons to be excited and cause the feelings that you would feel, which is why some people um, are even near people that drink alcohol when they're addicted to alcohol and they're trying to stop, that it causes them to feel the same type of way, and then they fall to their addiction and they indulge in it because they're still feeling slightly the way that they would feel if they would have a drink, not because they're feeling intoxicated, but because the dopamine is being released as an effect of the receptors that are on the that are in the brain. So the metaplasticity is really affecting them to the point where their brains are making them feel like they need to drink just because the way that they adapted to chronic exposure to alcohol. And sadly, this develops hyperexcitability in the neurons as well. So, which is very commonly seen when they stop drinking alcohol. So the symptoms of withdrawal can last for long periods of time when even if they haven't drank like even if they haven't drank in a while, the hyper excitability of their neurons lasts. So they still might feel symptoms of anxiety and shakiness and even nausea. And the relapse is way higher in patients who are addicted to alcohol and suffer from alcohol use disorder because their hyperexcitability of their neurons is so high that they're miserable when they're not using alcohol to the point where they rather be killing themselves slowly with drinking alcohol than suffer the symptoms without it. So it's pretty commonly known that alcohol is something that affects many different parts of the body and body systems. The liver is definitely probably the most commonly known, the well known, um, but it really just affects pretty much everything that you could think of in the body. Anything that has cells, which is pretty much the whole body. um, Basically because alcohol goes into the body and it needs to be broken down. Ethanol cannot just be absorbed into the body. It needs to be broken down into acetaldehyde. Um, but this is toxic to cells because this acetaldehyde can build up and causes intracellular damage to the proteins and can also induce cell death or apoptosis. It also affects the oxidation and reduction states of cells because they're constantly metabolizing ethanol, which has an impact on cellular respiration, and also it affects the ability for the metabolism of fats in humans, which, as we'll discuss later, can lead to something like fatty liver disease. So to start, I'm going to begin with the GI system, which, with the person that I interviewed, seems to be really their biggest issue. Frequently have to go to the doctor um, for things like GI bleeds, just inflammation, um, and just to be not to get disgusting, but just irregular stools, an inability to actually fully go to the bathroom most of the time, which is very common symptoms for someone who is chronically using alcohol. Um, Alcohol really promotes GI bleeds basically because of inflammation, um, not only to what you would commonly think like would cause diarrhea and stuff like that, like the large and small intestines, but also the esophagus and the stomach. Lots of inflammation, which can also not only be caused by the alcohol itself, but by the the subsequent vomiting and just emesis being put up through the body because of the intolerance of the amount of alcohol that the person is consuming, which is just destroying the GI mucosa and causing inflammation and swelling, and over time just degrades it to the point where people can develop GI diseases, irritable bowel syndrome, peptic ulcers, a bunch of different things. Especially if these people are drinking alcohol on an empty stomach, which, like I said, the person that I was interviewing, they tend they at the height of their disease, they were not even really eating. They were primarily drinking alcohol because alcohol um, basically took over that numbed their need to eat, and like we talked about the metaplasticity, they the dopamine levels that are released when they were drinking alcohol, they didn't feel any other need for anything else. The alcohol was enough, um, and it caused them to suffer from anorexia. So, but not only not only GI bleeds and inflammation is caused in the GI system, there's also acute pancreatitis, which in the general population of alcoholics is very serious because it can actually get to the point where it's chronic pancreatitis, and then even leads to cancer in the pancreas, which is even worse. And then to liver, which, like we talked about before, is very common in people who drink alcohol. Um, Fatty liver disease is basically like what I talked about before, about how there's a decrease in the oxidation of fatty acids, and there's metabolic changes that don't allow the body to successfully break down fats, which basically leads to one thing: fats building up, and in the liver especially, which causes fatty liver disease. But there's also the other common things that are more well known, like alcohol-induced hepatitis, which is non-communicable, and psoriasis of the liver. So the last two body systems that I'm going to go over are the nervous and the immune system. The immune system I kind of already went over in the fact that inflammation affects the whole body. It's very similar to the same thing with hypertension. How we have blood that circulates all over the body. We also have white blood cells that circulate all over the body. The white blood cells are fighting against pathogens and things that are being destructed. And alcohol is causing cellular damage, which is causing white blood cells to come and cause inflammation. Um, and especially people who are suffering from alcohol use disorder, this is chronic inflammation of the bowels, of the whole GI system in general. Can also be the liver, the pancreas, etc. Um, so yeah, so inflammation is causing bleeding, swelling, redness, tenderness, all these symptoms. Um, and then the nervous system, on the other hand, is is a little bit more um, confusing, but also interesting to me because um, the patient that I was interviewing, um, they always, since it's someone that I know, so they always would talk about how they would like their hands would shake a lot. I knew that, but they I didn't realize that the tingling and the numbness in their hands also had to do with the same thing, the nervous system and the way that they're hyper excited nerves. Their nerves are almost on edge, you could say, because of the upregulation of receptors. Um, and if they're not using alcohol, especially, the dopamine levels are not at the same level as they usually would be. The upregulation of the receptors is causing a excitability of their nerves. So they're just nervous, they're anxious, they're feeling tinglingness, numbness. Some patients can even have symptoms like to mimic a heart attack. They may feel pain in their extremities and in their back, in their chest. Um, this is has a lot to do with anxiety as well, but there's also destruction of the neurons. Um, Basically, it's alcohol abuse over a long period of time is progressive in its neurological disease, and it can cause effects in the way that they walk, in the way that they stand. Um, there can be destruction of the cerebellum due to like the overuse of alcohol in great quantities, causing a toxicity. There's so many brain cells that are actually killed during hangovers, which has a lot to do with dehydration as well. Um, the body is drinking. I mean, you're drinking so much alcohol, and the body cannot break down the amount of if you're drinking excessively, as most alcohol abusive people do, they can't break it down as fast as they're putting it in. So the buildup of ethanol in the body is not good. It's not able to be broken down, and even the buildup of acetaldehyde is not good in the body. Um, but there's also some less common neurological syndromes that have to do with like a thiamine deficiency, which I'm not really I like I said, that's also not really in the scope of this class, but I just found some research on it and I thought it was interesting. But it's a secondary effect to heavy drinking. Um, and these are things like Wernicke syndrome and Korsakoff syndrome, which I've heard of before, but I didn't really get much detail. but I do know that Wernicke syndrome has effects of encephalopathy, encephalopathy, uncoordinated muscle movements, um, and then Korsakoff syndrome is usually like amnesia, which a lot of people who drink alcohol suffer from amnesia. So I don't know about anybody else, but I literally never knew until I started this project that there were actual medications for people who are addicted to alcohol. Like I knew there was rehab, and I knew that there was like different preventative measures and all that, but I never knew that there was actually drugs out there that helped people who were addicted to alcohol. And the even crazier part is the person that I was interviewing had no idea either. So they're going to see the doctor. They probably have told the doctor that they were abusers of alcohol, and I guess they just never were offered, or maybe they just have denied it and they just never. I mean, the person that I interviewed doesn't really never really like drugs, and always felt like that doctors were always trying to like get money out of them and say that they had problems that they don't. But I mean, like they clearly knew that they had alcohol problems, so it's just interesting to me. But anyway, so basically, the pharmacological companies came up with a couple different ways to fight alcoholism. And if you think about the way that alcoholism is develops in patients, it's very easy to figure out what the drugs do. So the first drug, disulfiram, this basically has it basically um, lets the aldehyde buildup get to such a high level by inhibiting the ALDH activity, or which is basically the enzyme that breaks ethanol into um, acetaldehyde. It lets it get so high in the body, like 5 to 10 times higher than people who just that are regularly drinking alcohol, which then causes like extreme nausea and sickness. So like basically disulfiram is like a drug that causes people to drink alcohol and then get excessively sick, so they won't really want to drink it anymore. Which is it's really smart. I think that's like awesome that that's a thing. Um, the second, acamprostate, yeah. Um, this has to do with more like the metaplasticity effect and like the nervous system. So it basically just like is a way for like so basically how alcohol causes an upregulation of the GABA receptors. Um, I mean of the MDMA receptors, and a deregulation of the GABA receptors. It basically equalizes the balance that was affected by alcohol. So it basically gets the excitatory, I don't know why I can't ever say that, excitatory and inhibitory pathways. It gets them to be back to a regular balance for someone whose nervous system adapted to chronic alcohol abuse. And it just like completely alleviates this psychological and physiological discomfort that follows withdrawal as well. So basically it has a combination of like fixing the antagonizing NDMA glutamate receptors, but it also just like helps them with suffering from withdrawal, which is also pretty cool. I mean, like I guess the first one is a little bit more like if they can't control themselves, then when they drink, they're gonna get sick if they do follow through and take the medication. Or the second one, it actually fixes the way that they think. So I guess the second one's more like a psychological medication, which the person that I spoke to when I explained this to them, they were completely against, and they thought that they would never even consider taking that. Um, and then the third one, naltrexone, this is something that I recommended to the person who I interviewed because it reduces the craving for alcohol altogether. It has to do with the same thing, but it directly has to do with dopamine um, instead of the indirect receptors and transmitters. Um, but basically, it is mediated through interactions between the dopamine and the endogenous opioid neuropeptide systems. So basically, when they take this drug, the reinforcement and the positive feedback loop that happens, or the not the positive learning, reward, and behavioral processes that have to do with alcohol and addiction are reduced a lot because um, naltrexone basically functions as a competitive antagonist for the opioid receptors. So it basically binds to the receptors that way that it doesn't the alcohol can't really affect the body as much. So as for diagnostic testing, it's not really like like when it comes to other diseases, like how you would go like for let's just say my since we just did that case study, like myocardial infarction, like the blood tests and the troponin levels and like TSH and all that, like it's there's not really a lot of like blood work or like lab work that can really go into this. I mean, of course, you can take a BAC or a blood alcohol concentration, but just because someone has a high blood alcohol concentration doesn't mean that they have alcohol use disorder. It just means that within that acute period, they drank a lot of alcohol. Whether they do that every day, if you take a BAC every day for like a couple weeks, okay, that might show you some results on alcohol use disorder, but that's not very likely. But I guess you could do tests on the liver. Like I guess you could always do tests on the things that the diseases and the syndromes that people with alcohol use disorder would like have. You could do like blood pressure to see if they have hypertension, which would be something that could confirm your hypothesis. You could see if their liver is being able to there's accumulating fats, if they have like high density lipoprotein buildup. There's a lot of different tests you can do, but the major diagnostic testing for alcohol use disorder is just basically like a questionnaire and like a behavioral. It's more behavioral than anything else. Um, and to be diagnosed with alcohol use disorder, individuals must meet certain criteria, which is outlined by like this diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders. Um, and anyone meeting any two of the criteria uh, in the same 12-month period basically receives the diagnosis of alcohol use disorder. And there's different like levels, like there's mild, moderate, and severe. It just depends on like how many of the criteria that they hit. These are just some of them. There's actually like 11, I believe, but these are the main ones. Um, the first, have you ever had drinks or drank longer than you planned? A lot of alcoholics like plan not to drink and they drank anyway, or they plan to have one drink and they ended up staying at the bar all night. It's very common. The second is they tried to quit and then they decreased the amount of alcohol that they drank and then they went right back. Or they didn't even have, or they tried to quit and decrease and they couldn't. This is something that the person that I interviewed, they tried over and over again to stop, especially when times were good and maybe they had a good job and the things were good and they weren't stressed out. But as soon as something hit them, something bad happened, maybe they lost their job or just something happened, they weren't able to do anything besides drink alcohol. If the patient spends a lot of time drinking or suffering from hangovers, which is very common with people with alcohol use disorder, they drink even when they said they weren't going to drink, and then they suffer from the hangover, and to fix the hangover, they drink more. So, I mean, it's common sense. Experienced cravings, that's common. Um, has drinking interfered with personal life? This is a huge, huge, huge one. I mean, people who suffer from alcohol use disorder, they completely change what their motivations are. The things that make them happy are not the same things that would make a normal person happy, especially a parent. There's so many parents out there who are alcoholics who don't pay as much attention to their children, or they're not there for their children, or they do things to their children that a normal sober parent wouldn't do, or and vice versa. There's children who are alcoholics who mistreat their parents. It's alcohol, as anyone knows, is a huge effect on relationships between people, and not only just between people, but work. People are fired from their jobs. They don't do as well in school, etc. Um, had to drink more to experience the same effect. This is the same thing as tolerance, as we discussed before, and struggled with withdrawal symptoms, which we've already went over. We beat that like a dead horse. Okay, so preventative measures. Um, I mean, there's a lot of preventative measures to alcohol abuse just because it is so multifaceted. Um, the number one thing is to avoid drinking. If not, if you can't not drink at all, then just try not to drink excessively because that's a huge thing. Avoid drinking as a coping mechanism. If you start to associate drinking and happiness, and then on top of it, your nervous system is upregulating receptors in order to create the same effect mentally, and then you're basically using it as a coping mechanism, and then your body is becoming physically dependent to use it as a coping mechanism, which is just a terrible cycle. Um, Avoid drinking if it runs in your family. This is a multifactorial disease, as we'll discuss in the next slide, but if it runs in your family, there's a huge genetic basis for it as well. There's a lot of genetic reasons why people are more prone to being addicted to alcohol, um, but it running in your family is not only genetic; it's also environmental. Because if you're raised in a home where your parents were alcoholics, it's a lot more likely that you could become an alcoholic, even if you didn't inherit the genes that make you more prone to being an alcoholic. Um, Develop healthy stress management techniques. That's common sense. Maintain a healthy lifestyle. That's pretty much the same thing. Um, and watch who you're surrounding yourself with. This goes back on the environmental thing. If you're surrounding yourself with people that drink alcohol and you're more susceptible to being an alcoholic, they may drink over a weekend and be fine, and you may be wishing you had another one the next day, even though you have class or work or whatever. And other preventative measures, I guess you could say, um, I guess to like keep yourself from actually um, succumbing to death from alcohol use disorder. Realize that you have a problem. Go see help. Go talk to somebody. Maybe get prescribed one of those drugs that we discussed in the previous slide, or check yourself into rehab or something like that. So this is the discussion on basically how alcoholism is not just genetics and it's not just environmental. It's really just a mixture of the both of them. Um, it's it's interesting to me because we kind of already went over the environmental part in previous slides. I'll go over it a little bit again at the end, but I just want to get into the genetic part just because it's a little bit more relevant to the class, and it's also probably something that more people are interested in, and a little less common sense. But there's a couple different genetic bases, I guess, that cause alcoholism and make people more susceptible or not susceptible to alcoholism. And the first is just the way that the body breaks down alcohol. And there's like the genes that the genes that are encoding the enzymes that break down alcohol. So if someone so basically just a little background knowledge. We've already went over this, but I'll just go over it one more time. In this picture on the left, on the top, ethanol goes into the body. This is the consumption of alcohol. Alcohol dehydrogenase or ADH breaks that down into acetaldehyde. And then aldehyde dehydrogenase ALDH breaks that down into like acetic acid or acetyl CoA. Um, Patients who suffer from alcohol abuse tend to be really good at breaking down alcohol to its last form, acetic acid. If they're really good at breaking down alcohol, it doesn't last forever, and this is why it catches up with them and causes other issues. But it, people who have a genetic advantage with the enzymes that break down alcohol tend to have less negative side effects from drinking alcohol, which leads them to get that positive reinforcement and etc. So basically, when the enzymes in certain patients, let's more specifically ALDH, are not as functional, there's a huge buildup of acetaldehyde, which is toxic and can really lead to some unpleasant effects, which causes people to really not enjoy alcohol as much and just have a lower risk of alcoholism. This clearly is not the case for the patient that I interviewed, but I actually know so many people who just don't enjoy drinking alcohol. It's never been enjoyable. Just makes them it either makes them break out for some reason, or just basically because they just get sick no matter what, no matter even if they drink a little bit, or they just get very drunk off of a little bit. And this is interesting to me because this is probably a factor. Their genetics probably predispose them to they're less able to break down the alcohol to its final form, to its final digestible form, and they build up a toxic amount of acetaldehyde, making them sick and nauseous. The second is the genes encoding the brain signaling molecules, which we went over a lot, but basically, like I said before, alcohol modifies the function of the signaling systems, including the GABA and its receptors, um, which seems to be one of the main targets of alcohol in the brain. Um, Alcohol's effects on the GABA system can really just change how a person perceives alcohol, whether it to be pleasant or negative. If they have a certain variant of these genes, they may be particularly sensitive to alcohol's effects with lots of increase in dopamine, which makes them have a greater response to the alcohol use and make them want to drink alcohol. Like, because they're having a hypersensitivity to the alcohol in the brain. So, like, some people basically don't have such a strong sensitivity to alcohol in the brain, which doesn't really. So basically, they're not getting as much of an effect with them with like the whole metaplasticity thing. They're not. It's not changing as much. There's not so much metaplasticity, and those who are sensitive to it are the ones that are more likely to develop an alcoholic problem because they're getting a higher reinforcement um, when they drink alcohol. This third genetic basis with the immune function genes was a little confusing to me. I had to really just read like a lot of different things. I'm still a little confused. I think it's almost like preliminary. It's not like I think it's ongoing research. But basically, the immune system is activated by like a variety of factors, not only just alcohol, but stress, and those two things usually go hand in hand. People who are stressed, especially people with alcohol use disorder, use alcohol to deal with their stress, and both things have a huge effect on the immune system. And since the immune system like initiates responses like inflammation, um, it's just like interesting. Like how is inflammation something that increases the risk of alcoholism? And basically, from what I read, um, like immune immune activated signals fire through the brain, and they don't. It's not just inflammation, but they also interfere with important like um, decision making responses and inflammation reactions, and are just like super complex. It's another one of those things where like I'm just going to say like it's kind of like out of the scope of this class, but I thought I should cover it because it is one of the genetic bases. But they just talked about this like one key molecule. It's called nuclear factor, and it seems that like people who are affected by alcoholism have like a large amount of this factor in their genes. Um, and people who don't like have a alcohol dependence or don't suffer from alcoholism have less of this factor. And I don't really understand the whole basis of why the immune system and like decision making go hand in hand, but for some reason they said that. So if you want to do more, I can include the link if you want to do more research on that. But yeah, that's all I have for that one. And then last but not least, the genes that regulate the body's normal daily rhythm. This affects alcohol abuse because basically, so every we all know about the circadian rhythm and like how the internal systems and how genes basically like influence basically our internal clock, the sleep wake cycle, and stuff like that. But our body has a normal rhythm for not just like sleeping and waking and the way that we feel during certain times of the day, but also like body temperature, blood pressure, just like basic overall homeostasis. And basically, when people have a more are more susceptible to for their circadian rhythm and just like their complete daily normal daily rhythms to get out of whack, alcohol abuse seems to be more prevalent in these people. Stress also plays a major role, and it activates certain clock genes, which can also result in drinking. So, like I said, alcoholism, and stress tend to go hand in hand, and this is a huge factor, is because stress as well as alcohol both affect um, normal daily rhythms. And I don't know about you, but when I am out of my daily rhythm, I am stressed. So it's I can see why someone who suffers from alcoholism and that's their coping mechanism, why if they're more susceptible to be put out of their normal daily rhythm because of certain genes that they have, then they would turn to alcohol more frequently than others. But I'm also just going to go over quickly just like this little picture that I have underneath the breakdown of picture. Um, just like there's so many different things in life that can be stressful, and I mean we're all college students, we're all stressed out right now, um, but the difference is some people have a genetic basis as well as environmental. You don't need both though. So someone who doesn't have any genetic basis for being an alcoholic can still become an alcoholic because they're stressed out a lot and they drink to cope with it. And it may not even make them feel really good at the moment, but it might just make them not have to deal with the stress that they're dealing with. Um, so like I said, we already went over a lot about how like the influences that you have and stress and just like who you surround yourself with are huge factors when it comes to alcoholism. But I just wanted to also just cover briefly like the environmental factors. I also just included these references just in case anyone would like be interested in doing some more research on their own. Just because I found this, even though this is a project for class and for points and stuff, I just really enjoyed doing this just because I never really looked into any of this. Like you always hear people say, "Oh, like alcohol is good for you or not good for you is okay, but in moderation." And you always like be like, "Oh, they're just saying that alcohol is like bad for you," but you never really like look. I never really looked into it, but after going through this class and like coming from a pathophysiological perspective, it was really interesting to like look into alcohol and how it really does have a huge effect on your body and can really not only damage it to the point of like causing death, but it changes the way that you think. It changes the body's processes. It damages the mucoses. It affects your immune system. It basically affects your entire body. It changes you. Um, so I really just like I enjoyed this assignment and I learned a lot. I learned a lot from the person that I interviewed as well. Like things I mean, they're obviously someone that I'm close with to use them for something like this, but it's just very interesting to think about like wow, like they have no idea. They've been suffering from alcohol use disorder, which they didn't even know, like they didn't even know what alcohol use disorder was. Like I get it. It's a new term. It always was alcoholics and alcoholism. Alcohol use disorder is I guess is like more of like the new like politically correct way to say it. But they had no idea that they had alcohol use disorder, um, and they didn't know that there was drugs that could assist them with that. Even though they tried to quit on their own and were unsuccessful, it was very especially for the person that interviewed. They suffered from guilt on top of it, so it was like a vicious cycle. They would drink, they would do things, and they would feel guilty about it, and then they would sober up and they would try to stop but then something stressful would happen, and then they wouldn't be able to handle the guilt or the stress, and they would drink, and then they would add to the guilt and the stress, and then it would affect their social relationships like work or school, and they wouldn't be able then they would have not be able to be successful, or whatever their problem was with that. And it's a constant vicious cycle, and a lot of people don't understand that it's not just like the stigmatism of how people view um like addiction. It as much as it was their choice to start drinking. A lot of people drink and they're not alcoholics. A lot of people have actual genetic bases. I don't know why. I don't even think that's a word. I don't know why I keep saying that. There's a lot of genetic basis behind alcoholism. So don't don't just think that people are like bad, or they're giving up, or they're just like depressed because they're suffering from alcoholism. There's actually a very scientific background to it, and it's very interesting. So like I said, here's the references. If you feel any interest to like look up anything, feel free. I found some really cool information on all these websites. So yeah, thanks for listening to me.